Some time ago, I made a set of dovetailed drawers for this wall cabinet here using a curious woodworking jig called the router bus. Once it was set up, I was able to batch out the through dovetails, and they really fit together well. And I made the grooves for the drawer bottoms with it, and I even used it to make the raised panel drawer fronts. I'll link to that video below if you want to check it out. But today I'm going to push that machine a little bit harder and I'm going to see what happens. We're going to make a complete raised panel door, including a profiled groove and full mortise and tenon construction with mitered sticking in the corners. You can, of course, use a router table to do this. In fact, there are several ways to do just about any woodworking task. And I'm not here to tell you that one way is necessarily better than the other. But a lot of folks consider the router bus to be a really clever machine that packs a tremendous amount of versatility into a small space, like a wall-hanging router table with all the jigs built in. And even though many in our audience don't have a router bus, I still think a lot of you will find it interesting to just see how tools like this works, because sometimes it's fun to learn different ways of doing things. And the router bus certainly is different. Now we've installed the router riser plate and fence accessories, and I've mounted the mortising table vertically on the front of the machine. This will allow the router bus to function like a regular router table for our first steps. We're going to use a profiled cope and stick router bit to route the edges of our frame. Now what makes this function so different from a regular router table is the workpiece will be passed beneath the router instead of on top of it, like you would do on a router table. To do this, we install feather boards to guide the workpiece and ensure that every cut is identical. Now at first this feels a little bit strange, but it didn't take long for it to feel perfectly natural. You just feed in one side, pull out the other. Now once the rails and stiles are all profiled on the edges, we want to connect them with mortise and tenon joints. This type of frame is much stronger than the typical cope and stick construction on cabinet doors. It may look difficult, but it's surprisingly simple once you get set up and going. First, we're going to cut the tenons. Since in the previous step we used a profiled bit to create this 1/4 inch wide groove in the edge, that's how thick we want the tenons to be. And they'll be 1 inch long, which makes this ruler a convenient spacer to set the router depth stop. A fence has been installed to hold the workpiece perpendicular to the underside of the router plate, and everything's clamped in place. The crank on the machine's top moves the carriage on the front, and the workpiece clamped to it, side to side beneath the router. That's how we feed the cut. The depth of your cut is set by moving the router forward and back on top of the machine and then locking it when you get it in place. Now all we're doing is cutting the inner face of our tenon back to the edge of our slot in the edge. And this can be done by eye for the first workpiece. Then lock everything in place and you can repeat that same cut over and over for all 4 tenons on our frame. Then you flip the workpiece to the other side and the same cut is made on the opposite face, which leaves a tenon that's exactly as thick as the slot in the edge of our stiles were. I've decided the width of my tenon though should be 1 3/4 inch, and it should set a 1/4 inch in from the outer edge of the frame. Those measurements are marked on one workpiece, and the tenon is cut narrower by turning the crank to advance the carriage while I push or pull the router on top to cut back to the lines by eye. This cutting by eye process can be repeated on all 4 tenons in the frame, or a note may be made of the numbers on the digital readout where each of the 2 cuts ended. Then the rest of my tenons may all be cut to the exact same width using that digital readout alone. You just return to the same readings. This is one of the things I really like best about this jig. You can repeat anything really precisely without having to lay out marks on every workpiece. Now for the mortises. We're using a 1/4 inch straight router bit because that's the thickness of both the tenons and the slots in the edges of the workpiece. We've installed the full mortising table accessory so we can clamp the workpiece in place. The end of the router bit is dropped down to the bottom of the slot, and the router plate is locked in that position. Then the depth stop is set to allow for a further inch plunge. That's the length of my tenon. Here we'll use the digital readout again. The carriage is positioned so the bit is a 1/4 inch from the end of the workpiece. Then the readout is zeroed out in that position. It's a deep cut, so we're going to make it in 2 passes. The first at half depth, turning the crank to advance the workpiece to the left until that digital readout reads 1 3/4 inches. Then the bits plunge the full depth and the carriage is reversed and we return back to 0. This process can now be repeated again and again for all the mortises in our frames, and it's surprisingly fast and repeatable. Of course, our mortise and tenon joints won't fully seat yet because the sticked profile on the edge is in the way. That has to be mitered, and this can be done by hand, but the router boss will do it as well with the same accessories used to cut the tenons, plus a couple pins inserted in the holes to hold the workpiece at 45 degrees. On the 2 door rails, the corners are simply trimmed back to the fillet in the profile on the edge. This may be easily done by eye, but the 2 door stiles must be laid out with a pencil by assembling the joint and carrying the position of the fillet over with a ruler. That angled line is just a reminder of which direction I'm cutting. Its position need not be precise. Again, cut by eye so the corner of the notch created touches the end of the line across the face of the workpiece. By touching the corner of the board and the bottom of the router plate, you can lock the bit plunge depth and repeat these same cuts again and again. That's it for the frame. Now for the raised panel in the center. This couldn't be simpler. A vertical raised panel bit is installed and the workpiece is mounted with the edge touching the bottom of the router platform. The cut is made in several light passes. Because the workpiece is securely mounted, you can cut in both directions. In fact, a climb cut, especially across the end grain, may give you a cleaner surface, and you can't make a climb cut with a router table, so this is a real advantage. I should note that there is a dust collection attachment for this that makes this process a lot cleaner, but I had to remove it so it wouldn't obstruct the view of the camera. When all 4 sides of the panel are shaped, the door is ready for final assembly. That's all there is to it. The process is definitely different from what many are used to, but there are a lot of advantages, especially the repeatability, because positions can be noted on the digital readout and then recorded to repeat again and again. Anyway, I thought you'd enjoy seeing something different, so I'll see you next time. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.